Hello and welcome back. In this week's video we're going to take a close look at blend modes, working with layers in Photoshop. Now there are a couple of key components to working with layers, and the blend mode is one that's often misunderstood and people sometimes get into trouble with them. So let's dive in and have a closer look. So starting with blend modes in Photoshop, and for people who are used to working in Lightroom, Photoshop can be a bit daunting because it's a first generation piece of software, and the layout of the tools and where things appear on the screen can be a little bit daunting. But we need to be able to see our layers palette, and if you are working in Photoshop and you don't see your layers palette, go up to the window dialog on the top menu panel and make sure that layers is ticked to activate the layers panel. So let's have a closer look now at the layers panel. And if you have a look at this example here, I have a document open that has a number of different layers on it. But firstly, let's just have a look here. We have blend modes, we have the opacity of the layer, and we also have a thing called fill. Now fill is something you're not going to use very often, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later. But the main thing we are going to look at today are the blending modes. And if we go back to our base layer, and if your base layer happens to be locked with a padlock symbol here, you won't be able to activate the blend mode. So to remove that padlock, all you need to do is just click on that. But if you click on the word normal, which is our default mode for the blend modes, you'll see all of the different blend modes will pop up. And by scrolling through those, you can have a look and see how that works. So we'll get into that a little bit in more detail. But then of course we'll come back and look at the opacity and the other types of layers very shortly. But one thing you can't do in Lightroom is you can't blend other images in to the base image, and you can't apply artistic filters to your images. So there is, at some point you're going to need to move into Photoshop and work with layers. So let's have a look at what these different blend modes do. So what do these blend modes actually do? Well, there's an easy way to have a look at how they work, and that's by looking at a summary of what the different blend modes do. So I've got an image here that gives us a bit of a breakup. So when we look at all of these different types of blend modes, some you'll never use, but the important ones we'll go through. But starting at the top, we have the normal blend modes, and for any new layer of any type that you apply to an image, the default is going to be the normal blend mode, which means that whatever happens on that layer is going to overwrite what's below. And that can be fine for a lot of things, but in other instances it's not the right thing. And then moving down from there, we have the dissolve blend mode, which I've never used in 25 years of using Photoshop. I haven't yet found a use for the dissolve blend mode. And then below that we have the darken blend modes, where when we use these blend modes, it's generally going to apply a darkening adjustment to an image. And then of course below that we have the opposite, we have the lighten blend modes. And then following on from that, we have blend modes that offer options for affecting the contrast in an image. And we will use quite a lot of these blend modes for different things. And then we get into a few more technical ones, which are very rarely used, but they do have uses for some particular effects. And the very last group, we have what they call the component blend modes, which affect the hue, saturation, color, or luminosity. And luminosity is a blend mode that you will quite often use. And the easy way to have a look at what these blend modes do is to just try them out on an image. And so we'll go back to an image now and just step through how those blend modes work. So moving back to an image that I've created some time ago, I've got a number of different types of blend modes and types of layers applied to this image. And when you're looking at an image that has a number of adjustment layers applied to it, you'll see on the left hand side a little eye figure, and that indicates that those layers are turned on. And if you want to go back to the original base layer and see that without the other layers, if you just move your mouse down to this box that contains the eye, hold down the Alt key and click there, it will turn all of these other layers off. And so what we had to start with was an image of an old rusty wreck of a car, and I wanted to add additional textural elements to it. And so when I've applied additional layers, I've added another layer from another image that contained more texture. I've applied a layer that's a Nick silver effects to build up the mid-tone contrast, and then I have a few adjustment layers, and let's look at those individually. And you'll see here that on this layer that I have applied to the image, I've also got a layer mask on it. So let's turn that one on and see the effect of that. And if I click onto the layer mask, then right mouse click and disable the layer mask, you'll see that what I've done, I've brought in another layer that contains just textural elements, but what I've done, I've blended it using the overlay blend mode. And when you're blending two images together that contain different elements, the overlay blend mode, soft light, sometimes hard light or vivid light, will give you differing effects. But let's go back and start from the basis. Here's my layer blended to normal, and let's just go here and have a look. I've left this at 100% opacity, so at normal blend mode, the layer that's above the base layer is completely obscuring the layer. And if I was to reduce the opacity, you would see some of the base layer start to come through. But that's not really an effective way to add texture or other elements to an image. So let's just take that opacity back up to 100% and let's investigate the different blend modes. And the beauty of working with these blending modes is that as you move your cursor down through them, you will see the effect. And you'll see that dissolve doesn't appear to do anything in this case. Darken blend mode applies the darkest parts of the top image to overwrite the image below. So it's not an effective way for working with this particular image. And if we go to multiply, it actually doubles the luminosity values for each of those darker parts of the image. Again, not something that's going to work for this image. And then we can move through the other blend modes, and they all work in a different mathematical way to blend the information together. And you'll see that a lot of those are not really suitable for what we want to do. Once we move down into the lighten blend modes, we have the opposite effect from the darken blend mode, is that we're blending to all the lighter elements in the image. Again, not really what we want to do. And there's information online at Adobe that can give you a lengthy explanation of how all these work. But I always find the easiest way to work is to just experiment with them. And for adding texture or other elements to a base image, usually overlay, soft light, sometimes hard light or vivid light are the ways to go. And let's just move down through all of these other blend modes, and you can see the effects. Some are horrible and some are really quite strange. But again, by experimenting with these, for instance, blending the hues together, we're looking at how the different colors blend together. Blending by saturation will blend on the basis of which are the more saturated colors. Blending it with color sometimes is really useful, but not in this instance. And luminosity will just blend them on the basis of which are the lighter and darker tones. So as you can see, when we're looking at these sorts of blending, something like overlay or soft light is the way to go when you're blending textural elements. But at 100% opacity, it's way too strong. We don't want that effect, and so we come back to our opacity and we'll bring that back to something that looks a little bit more realistic. And if you can click on the little down arrow next to the percentage and move the slider up and down. And if we move it all the way to 0, we have no effect of this layer because it's at 0 opacity. And if we go all the way to 100%, obviously, that's the full effect. But with the overlay blend modes, it tends to build up the contrast and the saturation quite dramatically. And so that's not really going to be appropriate. I think I had it blended at around 75% in this instance, and that gave me quite a crunchy amount of textural elements added to the image. But what I also found was I didn't really want this added texture blended on the badge on the bonnet of the vehicle, and so I created a mask on that layer And if I hold down the Alt key, click on the mask, you'll see that I've very roughly painted that part of the image out, and we'll just fix that up now. And painting on at 100% opacity. And again, it doesn't need to be super accurate because you've got a feathered edge on that mask. Go back to the mask, click on Alt to go back to our image. You can see now that the effect of that texture has not affected the word comma at all. And if I just wanted to add a little bit of that texture, I could again click on my mask and then go up to the properties panel and look at the density of that. And by moving the density back down, I can start to introduce some of that texture back into the image. Now, I really decided I didn't want any of that texture on that part of the image, so I'll leave it back at 100%. So that gives you a really clear idea of how the different blend modes apply when you're adding texture or a secondary image to blend in with a base image. But in this instance, what I wanted to do was I wanted to enhance the mid-tone contrast, and a really smart way to do this is to use one of the Nik filters, and I won't do this again because it's already been done, but using Silver Effects Pro and one of the high structure type of filters, you can then add some mid-tone contrast, which I've done here, and it's fairly subtle. If I bring the opacity back up to 100%, you'll see that using, again, I've changed to a different blend mode, because if I blended the Silver Effects Pro to normal, I'm going to end up with a monochrome image. I don't want the monochrome image, so all I really want from that layer is the luminosity or the tonal values blending in with this image. And if I turn that layer off and then back on again, you'll see that it's lifted up some of the mid-tones and given me a little more contrast. But generally I find that that's way too strong at 100%, so I drop it back to somewhere around 50% to give me just that added little bit of mid-tone contrast. And then above that we have some adjustment layers, and in this instance we're looking at a curves adjustment layer, and I felt the overall image was a little bit light. So if we turn this one back on, you'll see that by pulling down the bottom part of the curve, I've darkened part of the image. And of course, every time you put on an adjustment layer, you have a mask applied with that, but in this case I'm not masking anything out. I want it applied to the whole image, and I've blended it to normal. And you'll see that when you darken any part of the image with any of the adjustment layers, it will also increase the saturation, and that's just a way that all image editing programs work. When you darken part of the image, contrary to how we see things in the real world, it adds saturation, whereas in the real world, when we see things in a darkened room, for instance, the color looks less saturated. But in this case, I don't mind that. That's quite okay. I quite like the look of that. But I could blend that to luminosity, and I would mitigate that slightly. It doesn't completely remove the added saturation, but you could always use luminosity with a curves layer, because all we're really doing is lightening and darkening parts of the image. Then I applied another adjustment layer, this time to form a vignette, and if I alt click on the mask, you'll see that I've just applied a very rough mask to darken around the edges of the image. And then finally, in this case, I used what's called the auto mode on a curves layer, just to try and correct a little bit of a color shift. And this is a really good way to fix up a little bit of a color shift once you've added adjustment layers to an image, and to engage that when you create a new curves layer. And let's turn this one off and we'll do it again. We'll add a new curves adjustment layer, and then by default you'll see it's blended to normal and there's nothing happening. And if you come up to the little auto button here, hold down the Alt key, click on that to set up the options. I normally have it set to enhance monochrome contrast and snap to neutral midtones, and I will save that as a default. And you'll see now that it's done something with the different channels, and you can see here that it's taken a little bit of the bluey cast out of the image and added a bit more warmth to it. And that's basically all I did to that image. So that's an example of how the different blend modes can work to build up your image. So let's now look at a couple of other examples where I've used slightly different blending modes. And this one, which is really all just about texture, let's go back and take it back to the original image. And you'll see here the base image is still locked. So if I click on that base image, I can't access the blending modes. If I wanted to, you're not going to change the blending mode of the background image anyway. But if I wanted to access that, if I click on there to remove the lock on that layer, you'll see that I can now access the blend modes. But of course, with our base layer, we don't want to do that. So let's just turn all the other adjustment layers off and take this back. It was a piece of artwork that involved some stainless steel with a lot of texture on it, and I wanted to really enhance that textural quality. So I brought in another image from a similar area that it was really all about lots of sort of textural elements. In this case, I've blended it to hard light, and I've left the opacity at 85%. Let's just take that all the way up. And when you're playing with the opacity, as I said, you could hit the drop down arrow and move the slider. But if you just move your mouse onto the word opacity and slide it backwards and forwards, you have exactly the same effect. So in this instance, I've blended it to hard light. Let's have a look at what the other blend modes do. See, overlay in this case does very little. Soft light does even less. And so I went back to hard light and I thought, oh yeah, that's pretty much what I was looking for. And I really wanted to just darken down. I like this sort of curvy shape, and so I wanted to darken down these areas. And you'll see here I've applied a curve with a fairly aggressive curve, and in this instance I've selected out those areas or painted them out. You can see in some instances my brushwork is fairly rough, and I'm going to change that to white to paint that on, and I can either hit this little two-ended arrow here or use the X key to swap from one to the other. Let's just tidy those areas up. In this case it doesn't really matter that much, but let's just tidy it up. Click on Alt again to remove that, and you'll see I've darkened down those darker areas. And then finally I used another of the Nik filters in the Color Effects Pro. I used a bit of dark contrast just to add a little bit more texture. I love the texture in this image. So in this case, using one of the other contrast blend modes, hard light, worked really well in this instance. So we'll have a look at a couple of more to illustrate further. For this next image, it's a little bit more complicated, so we'll just step through this a little bit quickly, but give you the idea of some of the blending modes and how we can use those to really affect the image. This is an image I worked up previously from an area over in the Daintree rainforest area in Queensland, which I was quite happy with, but I felt it needed something additional. And so with a little bit of whimsy, I also found this image that I'd made taken through an aquarium window, also up in the Cairns area, and I thought, well, that could be handy to add into my background, like a giant fish about to eat the tree. So with this image, I selected the fish out and then pasted it in as an extra layer. Now I've grouped all of these into a group of layers, so let's just go and have a look at it. In this instance, we'll turn the fish on. I copied the fish from the other image, pasted it in, and then used the Edit Transform tools to flip it. Edit Transform, flip horizontal, turned it from facing to the left to facing to the right, and that's all I needed to do with that. But then I found that some of the masking wasn't quite brilliant, and I've used this image in another video, and so you'll be aware of that. And so I had to do a little bit of work there, just painting around the edges with a very fine brush to remove some of the areas that weren't quite correct. But I started off with this fish and I thought, well, this looks like a bit of fun. It's a whimsical image. And then I've applied additional adjustments to this. and we'll just have to turn them all off to see where we're at. Let's turn that back on. And you'll see that the fish as it came in was a little bit blue, so I've had to do a little bit of color correction on this. The first thing I did was darken the whole thing down just on the underside of the fish, because I've now taken the fish from the aquarium and put it out hovering in the sky, and so I need to have the underside of the fish a little bit darker. So I just painted that in, a little bit hard to see, but you'll see there the bottom of the fish is a bit darker. And then I decided it needed a little bit more darkening, so I did another adjustment layer. And these are all blended to normal, so I'm not too worried about trying to keep to luminosity blend mode. Normal blend mode works fine for this. And then I came back to a color correction layer, which is another one of our adjustment layers. And you'll see here that I've warmed the fish up because it was way too cool, didn't look appropriate, didn't look like it belonged there. And so I've brought that back to more of a matching colorway to the background. Again, needed a little bit more treatment to darken that down. Again, all of these are using normal blend mode. Again, painting little areas in as I go. I painted a little bit more sunshine on the top of the fish, and then I decided that we needed to alter the saturation just a little bit. That's very subtle, we can't see that really terribly well, and added a little bit more contrast to the fish, and it was starting then to look pretty good. So let's just close that group up, and I'll put all of those layers together into a group so that I can turn them off and on quite simply by just hitting the one button. But then that looked okay, but I realized that the tree is here and the sun's out and there's a shadow underneath, so I needed to add a shadow under the fish to make it look realistic. And all that is a curves blend adjustment layer, blended to normal, 100% opacity, and then with a mask on it, just painted that in quite simply with a brush, just to give the effect of a shadow. You'll see here that I've darkened that quite substantially, and that now has a realistic looking shadow underneath it. And then I decided I wanted to do something a little bit more to try and blend these colors together to match it more appropriately, and I've used what's called a lookup table, which is another type of adjustment layer from our adjustments palette. And you'll see here, if I turn this on, it's quite subtle. I've blended this to soft light and a very low opacity, 15%. So if I turn that back to normal and 100%, you'll see that it adds a horrible effect. And in this instance, I think I used teal orange plus contrast. Doesn't sound like it means much, but with these lookup tables, you need to blend them very gently. And so I went back to the soft light blend mode, and again at 100% opacity, it's still way too contrasty. And so by bringing it back down to about 15%, I think was what I had, all it's done is just done quite a subtle blending of the colors, and then finally a slight vignette. And very last thing I did was I applied the selective sharpening filter using an unsharp mask, and then purely applying it to the fish. You'll see here I've just painted that in on the fish just to give that fish a little bit more sharpness and a little bit more contrast. And there we have our imaginary fish floating in the air. Now, one thing I neglected to mention in looking at this fish overlay, you'll see if I open this group of layers up again, you'll see that each of these layers has a little downward facing arrow. And what I've done here is, because I've brought the fish in as an additional layer over the top of the background, I wanted to contain all of these adjustments to this particular layer. And this is using what's called a clipping mask. And it just means that the effect is locked into the layer immediately below. And each one of these successive ones is also locked into the layer below, so that it's really only affecting the fish. I didn't want to change anything at all on the background. And when you create a new, say a curves or any other adjustment layer, you've got the option of applying a clipping mask to that. And if I was to let's just close that one up again. By putting this adjustment layer here, if I was to apply a clipping mask, you'll see it's disappeared because it's now being applied to the layer below with the fish, and that part of the fish is not visible, so that disappears. Clipping masks are a way that you can apply adjustments just to a particular layer, and it saves having to reproduce masks and other parts of things. So let's now move on to another image for a final look at some adjustments and blending modes. So let's now have a look at a couple of final images and then we'll sum it all up. So getting rid of our fish, we'll close him down. And I've got a couple of images here just to reinforce the idea of using textures as additional elements in photographs. This was a street scene photographed somewhere in Germany a few years ago. Nice enough image, but lacking any real strong interest. And so what I did was I brought in another layer of texture. Let's just change it to normal blend mode. It's currently blended to soft light. As you'll see, normal blend mode, it's just a photograph of a wall with a lot of texture in it. And it's a good idea to go around and photograph these sorts of things and put them into a collection in Lightroom so that you can use them for adding to images like this where there's something additional needed to give the image a little bit more interest. So in this instance, overlay I thought was a little bit too aggressive. Soft light just gave me a subtle amount of textural elements added into it. I quite liked that. Having done that, I then used the Nik Silver Efex Pro again to add some mid-tone contrast and help bring out all of that subtlety of the contrast in this wall. I quite liked that. Again, using Silver Efex because it's a monochrome filter, I blended it to luminosity, and again 57%. It was a little bit too strong at 100%, and bringing it back to 57% or thereabouts just gave me a nice amount of texture. I then simply just added a vignette, again using fairly rough brushed in effect, and I thought that the plants at the top were a little bit too bright, so I just darkened those down. And then finally, to just give it a little bit more strength, I used one of the Nik Color Efex Pro filters, in this case bleach bypass, blended to normal, and at 46%. Again, at 100%, it really bleaches a lot of the color out. That was too much. So bringing it back to 40-something% just gave me a slightly aged look to the image. So again, using those blend modes to create an effect is a really good way to work with doing something more with an image that's fairly standard. Now finally, I mentioned at the beginning that we'd look at what the word fill did on an adjustment layer, and what I did here, this is a title for one of my books, and I've added a text here. Now if I turn all those effects off, I used the text tool to add a text onto the image. In this case it was, let's just double click on that to select it. It was using a Century Gothic font, 120 point, sharp, and using white as the text. If I just click off that again, you'll see now that it was at 100% opacity and the word is quite strong. So what I did was I went into right mouse click on the text layer and went into my blending options, which is a whole different ballpark from our blending options that we've talked about so far. And this is where you can do things like add a stroke to the image, which is adding a little black outline to each of the letters. And I also added a drop shadow, which just gives you that little shadowy effect so that it looks as though the text is floating. If I turn that off, you'll see that on its own, the stroke around the letters was not quite effective enough. And if I just did the drop shadow, again, it wasn't quite enough. So using those two effects, and then my secret here is I've reduced the fill on that to 50%. So if I used the white text and left it at 100%, it was a little bit too strong, but by reducing the fill to about 50%, you'll see now that the colors of the image behind is starting to come through. And this is where the fill effect becomes effective. Now, if I take that all the way down to 0, I've really just got the outline of those letters. It's a little bit too subtle. So by bringing that back into around 50%, it gave quite a nice effect for a book cover. So that's our dive into blend modes. I hope that's all been interesting, and I expect that you're going to go away and experiment, because that's the way you'll learn about using blend modes. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.